Before Australia became a country, it was a collection of 6 colonies of Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, and Queensland. Each of these colonies was self-directing and autonomous. They had a premier and a government, and they made their own rules basically. They weren't governed by the British government. Australia at that time had 4 million people, just under 4 million people, and in a country of that size, of slightly under 3 million square miles, it's very sparsely populated. So for a long time the colonies didn't interact very much due to the size and distance. The thing that changed in the late 1800s was that a system of telegraph lines was established, enabling the colonies to communicate with each other. There was also some improvements in transport and roadways, so you could travel between the colonies more easily. Another thing that was changing in the country was that many people were Australian born with European heritage. They considered themselves to be Australians, not to be Europeans or Englishmen, but native Australians, and there were several popular poets and songwriters at the time who were creating works that celebrated the idea of being Australian. All of this gave rise to this idea that Australia could become a country, and it was perhaps time that they did. So this gentleman, Henry Parkes, initiated a conference in Sydney to discuss the idea of federating and creating a nation. At this conference, which was held in 1890, New Zealand and Fiji attended to consider the idea that they might also join Australia and be part of that country. Of course they didn't, and later on they formed their own nations. So, for several weeks this conference was held, and delegates from all the colonies discussed how Australian federal government would work and also what the constitution would be like. They talked about ideas from the Canadian system, the Swiss system, and the US system, because they were all fairly recently federated countries with structures that they liked and they wanted to take some ideas from. So by the end of the conference, all the delegates from all the colonies had agreed that it was time to form a nation. After they had left and gone back to their original colonies, this fellow, Andrew Clark, started working on a working document of the Constitution while he was on a trip to London. Over time, the next 5 years, many people contributed ideas to what the Constitution could be like, including this person, Sir John Quick, who was a very major contributor to the Constitution. They ended up using a combination of the British North America Act from Canada, the US Constitution, and parts of the constitutions of all the Australian colonies. Over the next few years, there were meetings by different groups, and finally in 1895 the premiers decided to ask the people of their colonies to elect officials who would continue working on the Constitution. So they held a general election where all eligible voters, which were all men, voted on a group that would finish the Constitution and get everything ready to form a nation. By 1898 this was done, the Constitution was written, everything was decided, and it was time to hold a referendum to finally get an agreement from everyone in the country, well, all the voters that is, it was time for Australia to be a nation. This time in 1898 it didn't pass, because even though there was a majority yes vote in all the colonies of Western Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, New South Wales didn't quite get the majority they needed, a minimum of 80,000, to pass it. So they held the same vote again in 1899. With a lot of support and enthusiasm, it was passed. In 1900, the British Parliament acknowledged the wishes of the colonists to form their own nation and passed the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act on July 5, 1900. The Queen appointed a Governor-General to reside in Australia and be the ceremonial head of state on her behalf. The Governor-General isn't really an active political role, it's a ceremonial role, and that particular role isn't elected by the population. So, in 1901, the first Prime Minister of Australia, Edmund Barton, was sworn in on New Year's Day. He was a caretaker Prime Minister with a caretaker cabinet of 8 men, and initially they didn't make any laws because they weren't elected by the population. But once the first election was held the following year, Edmund Barton was elected and he became the first elected Prime Minister of Australia. And Australia has essentially that basic structure of government to this day.